Alright, in this video I'll be installing a pair of Shimano Deore M6100 hydraulic brakes on this GT Aggressor Pro. As always, like and subscribe if you like the content, and there'll be some links in the description. So I'll be installing the front brake first, and before I do that I'll just weigh this thing up here. These come preloaded with the mineral oil in them, so that does exist, so I'm not being unfair to the brakes that come with it. The lever's 125 grams. Tough to measure these with the cable, but it's about 296. About 296 grams. Gotta like loop the cable around the scale so that it doesn't sit on the ground. And the rear brake is slightly heavier, but only because the cable is slightly longer, so not very much heavier. Maybe 20 grams heavier at about 316. 317, give or take. Again, not perfect here because you gotta loop the cable around. So first things first, I'm going to take a 5mm and start taking off the brakes that came with this bike. Brakes that came with this bike, they are disc brakes, and I'm not changing the discs. So we're going to ride with the rotor that came with it. And all the mounting matches well for the Deore brakes. There's really only one issue with them, and I'll show that a little bit later. But they do work fine with this bike. They're just a little modification has to be made. You don't need to save any of the hardware from the old brakes. The Shimano stuff comes with the required screws, and there's already Loctite on the screw. So after I take off the old caliper, I still sort of have it hanging there. I'm just going to mount up the new caliper as I work from the bottom up. Technically, I could have put this on loosely, but I do sort of clamp it down tight, but I have to come back and adjust its position anyway, so no need to put it on tight at this point in time. But getting it on the bike just prevents it from flopping around. Like I said, I do have to come back and adjust it, otherwise it'll be grinding on the rotor. And they do come with these little bolt clips. They just go on the head of the bolt so that it doesn't back itself out. I'm not sure if it matters which one you put it on, but I put it on the top one in both configurations. For these GT Aggressor Pros, there's an additional bolt on the fork that needs to come off, and that just holds the cabling in place. So remove it and then install the new cable. Unfortunately, I'm not sure where some of my Allen keys went, so I had to end up using some Torx bits on this. Not really the right tool for the job, but I got things done and didn't strip anything out. So now moving up to the handlebar, obviously you got to get the old brake lever off, and I do have these lock-on grips on this bike, so I'll remove those as well completely. And now I could loosen up the shifter and then loosen the brake lever and completely remove it from the bike. And that's it. The entire front brake is now removed from the bike, and I'm ready to put on the new brake lever. And just for reference, I do use a torque wrench on all of the new parts, and the torque spec on these says between 4 and 6 Newton meters. And here's the old front brake. So it's weighing in at 325. So it is heavier. And this is the issue with the brake lever. So there's a piece on the brake lever that connects to the handlebar. It's supposed to have direct contact with the handlebar. It's not supposed to be touching the grip. But my understanding is the shifter is supposed to go in between that space. It's just that this shifter doesn't really jive with that. Maybe there's other shifters out there now that do. If I go to a 1x drivetrain on this bike, obviously that wouldn't be a problem anymore, and I could do it normally. But this is the solution I came up with, and the brake lever is good. It's not squishy in any way, so that's what I'm going to do for now. Once I go to the 1x drivetrain and change the rear derailleur, I'll change the rear shifter and see if I can get something that jives with these brakes. But honestly, this works fine, and I'm sure it's not to specification. I'm sure it's not what they intended, but no issues. It's not squishy. It doesn't move around. Seems absolutely fine. So that is the one hiccup with these brakes on this bike with how it comes set up from the factory. And like I said, I do use the torque wrench on all these new parts. So the torque spec I'm using is 6 Newton meters. And obviously you're going to want to grip everything and make sure everything is set up properly as you want it for your hand and how you want your hands to sit on the handlebar and how you want to grip the brake and how you want to use the shifter. And the next thing I'm going to do is cut the cable down a little bit. I'm going to keep it long because we're going to change this fork. I might have to cut it again, in which case, it'll be a little bit more work. But when we get a new suspension fork, I don't want to get something and have to replace the whole cable. So what I'm doing is setting the witness mark, which I'm going to have at the E of brake, and then I'm going 11 millimeters back from that. And the witness mark is where you will see the cable sticking out of the flare nut. And the flare nut is just that nut on the end. Now, I don't have the fancy cutting tool. So like I said, I went to the E on brake, and then I'm going 11 millimeters back. And I'm going to do the most squared off straight cut I can do. And this is the tool I picked out of my toolbox to do this with. Now I got to insert the connector hose into the brake line. This is tight. You're not going to be able to do it by hand. And this is the benefit of having the specialized Shimano tool, because it'll cut the hose and there's another attachment for this end piece as well. The solution I came up with is to use it's not a rubber mallet, it's called a dead blow, so it's plastic. And then just holding it with some vice grips. The vice grips aren't clamped down. Obviously I got the towel around it too, so I don't collapse the hose and do any damage to it. But it is a pain. You won't get it in by hand unless you got some serious finger strength here. But you do want the connector flush with the hose. Now I got the brake lever pointing down so that no oil leaks out when I take off the plug. And I'm just going to insert the brake hose all the way in. So it goes through the flare nut, and there's supposed to be an olive in there. So the installation manual would have me believe I didn't take it apart, but I'm not leaking and everything gets clamped down properly. Now I'm just going to tighten up the flare nut using an 8mm wrench, and I'm going for 5 to 7 Newton meters. I'm not really sure what 5 to 7 Newton meters feels like on this wrench, but snug. I do it snugly. Then there's a little brake block that needs to be removed, and then the brake's going to work. I had no real issues with this straight out of the box as is. There's definitely air in the line. So I give it a few pumps, the brake's working. And then I just put the hose cover over the brake, which you obviously have to put on before you install the hose into the brake lever. Now to set the caliper, I just loosen the bolts, I squeeze the brake lever, and that'll put the caliper centered on the brake, and then I just tighten up the bolts. So I'm still holding the brake, can't really see it with my left hand, but I do it, and then I reinstall that snap ring. I do a brake bed-in on this bike, not right now, just sort of testing it out. Like I said, I actually found that the front brake and rear brake hooked up pretty well straight out of the box without doing any brake bleeding, but I do have a brake bleed kit and some oil that I've had kicking around for a long time, so I do some brake bleeding as well. But like I said, they work pretty well right out of the box. I have this Filzer brake bleed kit. Maybe I'll do another brake bleed video at a different point in time, but I'm not really changing the brake fluid. I'm just running some brake fluid through it so that I can get all the air out. And you can see some air bubbles coming out of the brake line. And I actually reuse the brake fluid because obviously it's brand new brake fluid in the brakes, and this is new as well. So I just run about 30 milliliters of the brake fluid through it, and then after that they're really good. And that's about it for the fronts. So for the rears, pretty similar process overall. Kind of do it a little bit faster here. So take out the 2 bolts holding the rear brake caliper in place, and just sort of remove all the clips, pass it forward on the bike, and then I'll take the new brake caliper. This time I'm going to put the bolts in just snugly so that I can still move the caliper. Obviously this time I am aware that I'm going to have to go back and adjust it a little bit to get the fitment correct. And the Allen key I'm using for this is a 5mm. So tighten up the 2 bolts, and then you can see these little clips that come with the GT Aggressor Pro. I'll just snap the cable in place all the way up until I get to the last one, and then I'll go work on the brake lever. So same deal, I got the lock-on grip that needs to come off. I'm going to loosen up the shifter because I'm going to have to move that around for the new brake lever, and then I can take the brake lever and remove it. And you're not supposed to use a torque wrench for loosening bolts, but they're not very tight. I don't think it'll be a big deal. So I already know that I'm going to put the brake lever on top of the grip. So I'm just going to start off like that, and then I'll get it where I want it. Make sure everything's squared away. Again, using a torque bit on my lock-on grips. I don't know where that Allen key went, but I guess it walked away from my garage. And then I'll use the torque wrench, again going to 6 Newton meters on the brake, and I use the torque wrench and go to 6 Newton meters on the shifter as well. So just like on the front brake, I'm going to set my witness mark, which is where the hose comes out of the flare nuts. I'm going to have it right there, sort of pinch it with my hand. Then I take my ruler and I'm going to go 11 millimeters longer than that, or 1.1 centimeter. Take that mark very scientifically, and then I'll use these cutters that are actually for plumbing and try to make the squarest cut I can in the hose. And overall, pretty square. Did a really good job with those. Next thing I'm going to do is install the connector insert into the brake hose. Again, I use vice grips, not really tight, just so that I have something to hammer against, and then use the plastic dead blow to get it all the way in and flush with the hose. Now I'll remove the cap out of the brake. Insert the hose all the way in past the olive. Push it in as far as it'll go. And tighten down the flare nut. Again, kind of tough to determine the Newton meters on this, but I make sure that the hose doesn't come back out. I make sure nothing's leaking. Remove the lever stop. Give the brake lever a few pulls. I'm not leaking any oil. Everything seems tight. And the last thing I'm going to do here is reset the caliper. So again, have it loose. Squeeze the brake lever. With the brake lever squeezed, I'll tighten up those 2 bolts, and then everything's good to go. No rubbing, no issues whatsoever. And just like in the front, I do run about 30 milliliters of brake fluid from the top to the bottom on the brake, just to get all the bubbles out. But the rear brakes worked well even before this, so I didn't have a huge amount of issue with air in the brake lines. And like I said, this isn't a brake bleed video. Maybe I'll do one in the future, but I just run the brake fluid from the top down, and this kit's pretty cheap. Overall, these brakes had a massive impact on this bike's stopping power. It's really night and day. So this is definitely a worthy upgrade on this bike. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.